One of the very first things we want to think about when we start playing jazz is how to swing. It's the very first word at the beginning of this etude. So how do we swing? We begin with our quarter note, and then we divide that into triplets. And then from there, all we have to do is take out the second note of each triplet. The next most important thing to think about when playing jazz is articulation. In jazz, whenever we have a musical phrase, we want to articulate the first note, the last note, the highest note, and the upbeats, unless they are surrounded by higher notes. So let's begin with this first two-measure phrase. We have our first note, our last note, our upbeats, and here we have an upbeat that is surrounded by two higher notes. So we don't want to articulate that note. So the first two measures will sound like this. Let's look at our next two-measure phrase. We have our first note, our last note, our highest note, and our upbeats. Because this upbeat is followed by our highest note, we will not articulate that note. So this phrase will sound like this. Moving on to our next phrase, we have our first note, our last note, and our upbeats, and our highest note. So that phrase will sound like this. Let's look at our next phrase. We have our first note, our last note, and our upbeats. So that measure will sound just like this. Looking at our next phrase, here's our first note, here's our last note, and we have all these upbeats here. So this phrase will sound like this. So we will articulate all of those upbeats because they are not surrounded by any higher notes. And finally, our last phrase. Here's our first note, which is accented, our last note, which is also accented, and our upbeats. So this phrase will sound just like this. Now that we've talked about how to swing and all of our jazz articulation rules, let's move on to how to make this piece a little more musical. So at the beginning, I always like to follow the shape of the melodic line. So if the notes are going up, we can let our dynamics go up as well. So this first phrase will sound like this. The next phrase would sound like this. The next phrase would be just like this. Let's look at our last two measures. Because the pitch is going up, we can take our dynamics up with it as well to make it more exciting. So that would sound like this. So that way we can end the piece with a big crescendo and make it really exciting. So now we've talked about how to swing, we've talked about our jazz articulation, And we talked about how to make this piece a little bit more musical. So now let's put that all together and see what that sounds like.